Welcome back to Starmergeddon. It's a new year and new podcast format. We are here, the two of us. I'm Georgina Finley. I'm going to be hosting this episode and future episodes, I think, if it all goes well. And I'm joined by the head of UK content, Ben Blissett.
Hello.
For Starmergeddon 2025. That's not the official name, but it is 2025. So why not add it?
Yeah.
We are going to have a slightly new format. We'll still have a main discussion every week about something major happening in UK politics. But we'll also now have a new segment called Cabinet Review, which will entail discussing one of Starmer's cabinet ministers, what they're up to in this week, whether it's going well or badly for them, and then a little extra story at the end of each episode.
Yeah. So there should be more in each episode?
More in each episode, yeah. More for you to get your ears stuck into. That imagery doesn't work.
Phrase, but we'll go with that.
Yeah. I'm learning. I'm learning.
Yeah.
There's so much happening in UK politics at the moment. There's so much for us to talk about today, but do you want to introduce quickly for 90 seconds what we're talking about in today's podcast and why it's important?
So the main thing we're talking about today is Elon Musk and his recent, and I think it's fair to describe it as obsession with British politics. You know, he's someone who is very big on the political scene in America at the moment. He's soon to be in Trump's cabinet. But for the last month or so, he seems to have tweeted more about British politics than anything else. I think I even saw a journalist have a look at the different categories of things Musk has been tweeting about over the last month, and British politics is like the top. His interest, though, doesn't just go back from the previous month. It seems to have gone back all the way to the beginning of this new Labour administration. So when Labour first took power, one of the big scandals, one of the big stories that they had to deal with was the Southport riots. Now, we've done a number of videos on this before, so it might be best if you don't know about them to watch those. But in essence, these were riots in response to the murder of children in Southport at a Taylor Swift dance class. There was a lot of misinformation spread on social media about the sort of ethnic makeup of the perpetrator. And Elon Musk got very involved in this very early on. I mean, one of the first things he said about this was civil war is inevitable. Starmer then posted that the attacks on Muslim communities in response to these riots should stop, and Musk replied to him suggesting, shouldn't you be concerned about all communities? You know, he got very, very invested in this story. We actually did release a video this week that sort of goes into Musk's obsession with British politics a little bit. But that seems to have been the starting point. I mean, we can speculate as to why he's interested in British politics. I think one of the main things is that he just has a very different view of freedom of speech coming from the US political scene than in Britain and most of Western Europe. I think here we have hate speech laws. We are interested in the effect of speech as well. There is free speech in Britain, but there is some limits on that to do with things like, as I say, hate speech and denigrating minorities. Like those are things that you can't do in this country. And I think Musk views that in a very different way. And that's sort of where he was coming at the Southport riots from. He was saying whatever he wanted. Media was responding to that, criticising Musk, criticising him, stoking flames in Southport. And I think he was frustrated that he was getting some pushback on that. And then ever since, he seems to have attacked Labour on basically any big scandal that crops up, whether it be the farmers' protests. He suggested that Britain was going full Stalin. He'd suggested that rioters in Southport, far-right rioters were being held in emergency detainment camps, despite the fact that obviously not being true. And then last week, and I suppose this is the main thrust of this podcast, he got involved in a debate about the Rotherham child sex abuse scandal. Now, there's a lot to discuss here, and there's a lot of history in this in the last 10 years, and how it interacts with Keir Starmer, how it interacts with the government, why people are calling for this now, which I'm sure we'll get into. But the point is that there has been a background to Musk criticising Labour. There are different reasons for that, but the big thing is his sort of like interest in British politics has massively stepped up in the last 2 weeks, and he's called a number of major Labour figures complicit in child sex abuse, effectively, in not doing more to prevent child sex abuse. There's a lot going on there, and I'm sure we'll get into all of that.
Yeah. great summary. There is so much going on there, and I'm sure we won't even scratch the surface. But keep watching Starmergeddon, and maybe we'll be able to get a bit deeper into some of these issues as we go along. I guess something very interesting as well is that Musk's politics, before we even get to how they interfere or interact with what's happening in the UK, have changed so much over the past decade. Do you want to run us through how and what especially has been happening in the past, I think, half a year, basically, kind of online?
So I think we all know that Musk at one point was at least sort of centre-left or centrist, maybe. He wasn't as far to the right as he is now.
And how do we know that?
Well, he donated to Clinton at one point.
Right.
He'd sort of spoken on some progressive causes. I mean, he bought an electric car company. His politics have evolved in the last 10 years. Up until the point Sunak was in charge, he didn't really get involved in British politics. It was all sort of American politics. And you can see him moving more to the right. I mean, I think he'd been moderately critical of Trump in his first term, and he's now obviously a big ally. He's courted many members of the right. He's now a member of Trump's cabinet. It's obvious where he is now. He's quite far on the right. In terms of British politics, he'd spoken in favour of Rishi Sunak when he was Prime Minister. Famously, he was sort of interviewed by Rishi Sunak when he was Prime Minister, which caused a lot of controversy here in the UK because the Prime Minister was, instead of being interviewed, was interviewing someone.
Yeah.
It's clear that there was some sort of respect between the two of them. Obviously, when Sunak was voted out, his politics was still moving further right, which sort of makes sense why he's it's understandable why he's criticised the Labour government considering where he is now. But if you'd have suggested that he would have made some of the criticisms that he's now making 10 years ago with the politics he had 10 years ago, I think most people wouldn't believe you. I think he was, the fact that, as I say, he'd sort of donated to Clinton at one point, he'd spoken out on some progressive causes, he bought an electric car company, he was relatively centrist, if not sort of centre-left. It's interesting to see his evolution over the last 10 years.
And I think if you're trying to maybe pinpoint where it started to shift, I think, for me anyway, it coincides, this swing to the kind of conspiratorial right, I'll call it, happened in tandem with Musk's takeover of Twitter, now X, I think, in 2022. And we've all seen, as users of that platform or former users of that platform, how just the proliferation of misinformation, of conspiracies, of hatred and divisive rhetoric coming from accounts that you can't even trace back to a human being in a lot of cases, And there's been a lot of discussion in the media about whether Elon Musk has been radicalized by his own platform. How much of that do you think has shaped his politics and maybe influenced?
Well, I think that the thing is he seems to use Twitter is almost like a primary source of information, and the way he tweets or posts and reposts other people, it doesn't seem to be being done with a great amount of care or deep research. And I suppose this is where we get onto the Rotherham situation, the child sex abuse situation. Because there's a hell of a lot of history to this in terms of Keir Starmer as the head of the CPS, when he becomes, an MP in 2015, how that interacts with the Chief Prosecutor for the North West of England, Nazir Afzal. He's obviously quite a big figure in this. There's a lot of background to this, and there's a lot of interacting parts here. And there is no doubt that certain institutions failed children in the late 2000s, early 2010s, but exactly where you attribute that blame is key. And to just jump on Starmer and try and attribute so much blame to him and Jess Phillips is disingenuous, and is entirely disingenuous to the previous inquiries, to how the CPS worked, the changes that Starmer made. I don't think he looks into these things with a great amount of detail or that critically. I think he's had it out for Starmer since the Southport riots. I think that's been clear in the way that he's tweeted about Starmer since the Southport riots. I think there's a lot to do with his approach to freedom of speech. I would even go as far as to suggest that the way that the online safety bill is moving responsibility onto social media platforms like X probably comes into this as well. But I don't think he's looking at that I don't think he knows that much about British politics. I don't think he understands British politics, British culture. I don't think he understands the background to the Rotherham child sex abuse case. There's so much that, and I think he's a lot of this is driven by his pre-existing sort of disdain for Labour rather than an actual desire to protect children.
So that's some good background on Elon Musk's shifting politics. But if we talk a bit more about now the grooming gangs scandal specifically and what Musk has been saying about that. Some of our audience might not know much about this. It's a very complex and confusing event. But can you talk us through what this is and what Musk's been saying or getting wrong about it?
Yeah, so I think it's best if we just sort of go in chronological order. So effectively, Rotherham is often used as the example in this, but just I think it's worth pointing out that this has happened in a number of other cities. Effectively, in Rotherham and other cities, there were grooming gangs that took advantage of children. In a lot of these cases, it was from in Rotherham in particular, it was Pakistani men that were abusing white children, white girls. There was a reluctance by authorities in some cases to pursue the case for a number of reasons. One is community tension. Another is not believing the victims. But the way that Starmer interacts with this is that he became the head of the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, in 2008 and remained head of the CPS until 2013. Between 2008 and 2009, the CPS was criticised for not proceeding with a prosecution in Rochdale on the basis that the main victim was unreliable following an investigation in that year. So Keir Starmer was the head of the CPS then. Now, it's important to note that while Starmer was head of the CPS, a lot changed under him. So the chief prosecutor for the Northwest of England is Nazir Afzal. He overturned that previous decision in 2008 not to look into the Rochdale grooming scandal after having been appointed by Keir Starmer. He effectively said the basis of that was that they believed what the victims were saying about that case. Afzal himself has actually claimed that the only way that we could bring the case was to admit that we'd failed the victims in the past when they'd first made the complaint in 2008, and that Keir Starmer was 100% behind the decision to publicly admit that we'd got it wrong. So in 2013, Starmer actually changed the way that changed CPS procedures on how they deal with grooming cases. And by the time that Starmer left the CPS, they had one of the highest conviction rates in its history in terms of grooming, and that's according to, again, Nazir Afzal. In all of this, there's a lot of claims that sort of Starmer didn't do enough. But the point is that he changed a lot of the procedures when he was in the CPS. There was a failure when he first took over the CPS to deal with the grooming cases. But by the time he'd left, he'd sort of changed a lot of that. He changed a lot of how that's... how people are prosecuted, the fact that the CPS actually went after these gangs. It was broken by a couple of newspapers in the early 2010s, and he's since Musk has criticised him, he's actually received a lot of support by people involved in this for his work at the CPS in changing how they deal with these cases. So the idea that Starmer covered things up or didn't want the CPS to prosecute certain groups for political reasons is false. And just to point out as well, it was the fact that Musk has actually claimed that Starmer had repeatedly ignored the pleas of vast numbers of little girls and their parents in order to secure political support.
This was a Musk quote.
This was a Musk quote. That is what Musk has claimed. Starmer wasn't a politician until 2015.
No.
He wasn't an MP until
Exactly.
2015. There would be no reason for Starmer to cover this up. Now, that's not to say that there weren't failings. The police have a lot to answer for here, and there's been a lot of criticism on the police for their failure to look into these. But and as I say, the CPS in 2008, 2009. But again, and I think it's important to stress here that we're a non-biased or we're non-partisan organisation. We don't align ourselves with any political party, and in a lot of instances, I think it's right to try and maintain impartiality. But when there is a claim being made about a politician that is plainly false, I don't think that's breaking impartiality or becoming partisan in defending a certain politician against things that are plainly untrue. And I think this is a situation where that is clearly the case.
I think I'll also jump in here and say it's not only that what Musk has been accusing Starmer of doing, i.e. covering up this grooming gang scandal, ignoring it, failing to deliver justice for the victims. This cover-up, it might have happened at the time in 2008, and there is value in discussing why that happened. Perhaps fear of racial issues coming into it did play a role. But at the same time, we grew up as teenagers in the 2010s. I remember this being a massive deal in the news. I remember hearing so much about the grooming gang scandal. The newspapers were plastering these faces of these men constantly. And, it was for a decade, it was a massive issue in the UK press. And this for me shows how recent Elon Musk's interest in UK politics is, that he's dredged up something that happened in 2008, between 2008 and 2013, and is now trying to piggyback on that and stir up all of this his historical stuff, which has been and gone. Well, it's not been and gone. It's, of course, there are important things to discuss here, but
And this is it as well. And just one other thing that I did want to add before just adding to what you've said is that when I was saying about the police and the way that the police had failed people, a good example of this is that victims were not seen as credible if so victims of child sex abuse were not seen as credible if they'd not immediately reported the abuse, if they'd used drugs, or if they'd used alcohol, or if they'd acted or dressed in a certain way. So that was the way that the police looked at these cases. So there is, again, I don't think anybody is claiming that institutions across the board had acted properly in those years. Evidently they hadn't. And evidently the CPS, as I previously said, the CPS accepted that there were failures by institutions and changed their practices to reflect that failure. So I don't think anybody across the board is saying that everybody acted perfectly throughout this situation. They didn't. There were gross failings. But that had happened. There'd been changes made. And the other thing, and this is what I wanted to add on to what you'd said, is that about dredging this up. There's so much discussion at the minute about a report, about a national report. And this is sort of how this whole conversation started in the last week, was Musk saying that there should be a national inquiry into the grooming scandal. Now, one of the things that the media hasn't, there's some parts of the media point this out, but not nearly strongly enough. And again, I think this is a criticism of Labour in the way that they've handled this in the last week. This should have been the first thing they pointed out, and they should have pointed this out very strongly. That has happened. There has been a report published in 2022 by Professor Alexis Kay, that looked into child sexual abuse. It was called the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, or the IICSA. And in fact, a lot of the people connected with that, so there's a group called the Act on IICSA campaign group, which is wanting the government to implement the changes that the report wants to make. The head of that has said that politicising the issue of sexual violence fails to acknowledge its lifelong impact and hinders the implementation of vital and urgent overhaul to our systems required. Our mission is not to call for new inquiries, but to advocate for the full implementation of the IICSA's recommendations. And in fact, the person that wrote the report, Professor Alexis Kay, also said similar, in that we shouldn't be doing another national review because it will slow down the implementation of changes suggested by that report that was published in 2022. And again, just some of the things that the IICSA has called for has been mandatory reporting, which we'll get onto in a separate section in a second, so I won't go too much into that. But mandatory reporting, national financial compensation for abuse victims, the creation of a child protection agency, more robust age verification for online platforms and services, and mandatory online pre-screening by tech platforms for sexual images of children. So a report's happened. And not only that, but one of the things that Musk had criticised was Jess Phillips, who's been again, and I think this is an important thing to point out as well, is that people across the political spectrum do a lot of work in different areas that sort of is outside of the ordinary scope of politics. So you can I think it's absolutely legitimate to praise certain politicians for the work they do on certain issues, and that not be like a political thing. Jess Phillips has been a fairly tireless campaigner for safety of women and girls for basically her entire career. I mean, it's one of the things she's most known for as a politician.
We should clarify her official title is Parliamentary Undersecretary of State for Safeguarding and Violence Against Women and Girls.
And she's been attacked by Musk in the last week. And
do you want to reuse the phrase that Musk?
I don't have it written down, so I'd prefer you to.
Sure, Musk has accused Jess Phillips of being a rape genocide apologist.
And that is an attack made against someone who is known most in politics for her campaigning and her work on violence against women and girls.
Yeah.
And again, if it was the Conservative Party or other parties sort of 10 years ago or 5 years ago even, I think all parties would be turning around and saying that's wrong. And if Jess Phillips was a Conservative, equally I think that 5-10 years ago people would be turning around and defending her. I think that this is a thing that sort of supersedes the day-to-day politics. You know, there is a point of sort of courtesy and professional respect between politicians that has existed, and you know, you can criticise each other for not doing this when you're in government, not doing this, but for that language to be used against a politician, I don't think it's a political thing to defend against that language, especially when it's against someone who has worked quite a lot in that field to be criticised for not doing enough. So I find it interesting that there hasn't been more defence outside of the Labour Party of Jess Phillips in this regard. Again, I think we'll get onto this later.
We will get back onto it.
Yeah,
I largely agree with everything you've said. I think it was a good analysis of why politicising such a traumatic issue about women's safety and, you know, weaponising that for Musk's own personal benefit is pretty awful, I think. What I also would like to add about the grooming gangs scandal is it's always really difficult so take the Rotherham grooming gang. The majority of men involved in that gang were of Pakistani heritage. And that is a fact. This is important to investigate. Of course it is. Like, why does that skew in a particular direction? But the other thing to say is that violence against women and girls happens every day in every part of the country by men of all creeds and colours and ages. And the issue in these cases is always that women and girls don't feel safe enough to come forward and report, you know, those abuses. And there can be a whole range of reasons why that doesn't happen. This is part of the reason that Keir Starmer was working to reform the justice system when he was head of the CPS. You know, to take one instance of a very serious, very nationwide issue, you know, to pick one example of a case where, you know, there was a particular ethnic minority that was more represented, and use that to effectively wash over all other cases of where this happens to make it into an issue about race and culture, which it's not. You know, it's an issue of men on female violence, is really missing the point.
When that was used, when people were using the Pakistan element, it was to show the reluctance by authorities to investigate.
And I understand that. I do understand that.
But I totally take your point that I think the thing that has been missing is that the CPS changed its practice. There was an investigation. There have been recommendations put forward.
Yeah.
You know, there's been a lot of work done since then that is glossed over because it doesn't fit the narrative of criticising those involved at the time.
Yeah.
And I think that is the part that has been missing from this whole debate, is the work that has been done since. And I think it would be legitimate to have a conversation about, is it enough? Is there more to do? You know, what the specific recommendations? If that is a conversation that certain organisations want to have, I think that is legitimate. People can debate that. But to exclude that from the debate, to fit a particular narrative of criticising certain people for political ends, I think that's sort of disingenuous. I think that's quite pointed and points to another agenda.
Yeah, and moving now to the cabinet review.
Sorry, this is not a
Brings us on
particularly
nicely.
fun episode.
No, it's not,
no,
but it's a very important one.
No, of course.
And there's so much more that I would wish to discuss about this that we won't have time for in this episode. But let's move on to the cabinet review
Yes.
now, which is our new segment.
Yes.
It's quite a good time, I guess, to have a cabinet review because there's so much involvement from
Yes.
all of Starmer's people. But do you want to give us again another 90-second summary of who we're talking about this week and why and how they tie into our main discussion?
Yeah, so for the Cabinet Review this week, we're going to be looking at Yvette Cooper, who's the Home Secretary. Now, she mounted a particularly strong defence of the Labour government in the House of Commons when she was responding to an attack by Lee Anderson, who's currently a Reform UK MP, but used to be a Conservative MP. And effectively, he was criticising Labour government for not doing more with child sexual abuse, it's specifically, things like Rotherham and things like that. So he was criticising the Labour government quite strongly on that. I think the reason that Yvette Cooper has done so well in this is that she mounted such a strong rebuttal against Lee Anderson. I think that she properly laid the government's cards on the table. And one of the things that she explained is this thing to do with mandatory reporting. So mandatory reporting is the idea that people who work in professions where they work with children would be required to report child sexual abuse if they come across it, and failure to do so would be a criminal offence. Now, she'd pointed out that 10 years ago, Yvette Cooper had called for that. She called for that to be implemented, and in the subsequent 9 years that the Conservatives were in, they didn't implement that. So for Anderson, who is obviously currently a Reform UK MP, but previously a Conservative MP, to criticise, it's that loses the work that Labour's doing. And this sort of goes back to my point that I was making earlier in the podcast, which is that there's been so much in this conversation about child sexual abuse and the Labour government currently, so much of events that happened between 2011, 12, 13, 14 and now have been completely lost in this debate. We seem to be focusing on a period of 5 years where there was horrible stuff happening and institutions failed. The police in particular failed in this regard, but there's been so little that has been discussed about the CPS and about how certain other actors responded to that. And I think the reason that Yvette Cooper gets praise for that this week is particularly her quite strong rebuttal and her sort of laying the facts out quite simply. And I think the other point as well is that Labour have been really bad at this. Just since they've got in, they've been really bad at responding to criticism and to responding, doing something and not publicising that they're doing it or making the argument. Other governments will do something and they'll sort of vociferously argue for what they've done. Labour seem to do a thing and then sort of back away from it. They don't really, and I think they need to be better and bolder in, if they're going to do something, sort of shout it, be proud of what you're doing. Because if you're the government, you should be proud of what you're doing. You should stand behind it. And there were so many examples of this. And I feel like we're getting to the point where Labour ministers are learning that's what they need to do. And I think Yvette Cooper's a really good example of that this week.
It's interesting that you say Yvette Cooper has been such a staunch, ally or supporter of Jess Phillips, as has Wes Streeting, which we talked about yesterday.
Streeting, yeah.
Do you think there has been a lack of a broader response from all sides of the political aisle in terms of what feels like very personal attacks against Jess Phillips by Musk?
I do. And as I said earlier, I do genuinely believe that 5 years ago, people across the political spectrum would be saying that attacks like that and the language used in particular are completely wrong. I think there's something that's been lost recently in politics. I think politics is becoming polarised. I think the way that our political system tends to differ from other countries, particularly the US, is that when push comes to shove, I think there is a mutual respect between politicians. And there are occasions through the political calendar that you see this. the state opening of Parliament, where the leader of the opposition and the Prime Minister walk together from the Commons to the Lords, and they have a conversation between them. There was a clip that went semi-viral this year of the two leaders. I think it was Rishi Sunak at the time and Keir Starmer, sort of, having what seemed like quite a pleasant conversation between the two of them. I think there is a degree of respect between politicians, and our political culture sort of allows for that. They meet at the Cenotaph each year for Remembrance Day. There's certain events like there's the Spectator event each year where they people go to this. It's sort of like the UK's equivalent of the White House Correspondents' Dinner, where they sort of like jokingly pull each other's leg a bit. And there seems to be some sort of respect, is my point, between the two of them. And there are certain events that encourage that respect. And I just worry that this recently demonstrates that level of respect is being lost. The fact that people aren't standing up for Jess Phillips implies that there isn't that respect between them. It implies that there isn't like a respect for the work that she's done.
I think one way to see it is maybe a loss of respect between the left and the right. I think the way I see it more is that there is a growing disunity among UK politics in general. If you see it, I guess, as a loss of respect between the left and the right, that's exactly what Musk wants to happen by stoking this kind of thing. Right? He wants to pit one side against the other, and he wants them to tear each other apart. And if the left and the right play into that, they're just giving Musk exactly what he wants. But if you see it not as a loss of respect between the left and the right, but actually what it is, which is British politics, a main party in government leading the country, a strong opposition, which is what you want, to hold it to account, both of them working kind of together as much as they can to take the party forward in the right direction, and external agitators like Musk on the outside, who shouldn't be having anything really to do with UK policy or UK politics or impacting, the feeling of average people on the streets, because he doesn't have anything to do with running this country. There should be a unity just within Parliament in Westminster against things like that. And we've seen that, there's been examples of Macron, for example, in France, came out and warned against Elon Musk's, what he called interference in, I think in this case it was against, in German politics with the upcoming election in February. We haven't had any real unity on that front, which in my head is so crucial. To have a functioning political system is for everyone to agree we have to stand united against this kind of wedge driving by people like Musk between us, because it's not helpful to anyone. And I think it's interesting also to see how parts of the right have almost swung more in Musk's favour. Like, you read the statement by Robert Jenrick,
yes,
right, recently, who was until just a month or two ago. Yep. Okay. Do you want to? I mean, where to start?
Do you want me to read it?
Maybe not the whole thing, but if you pick out a couple of lines that maybe struck you.
Yeah. So for decades, the most appalling crimes from predominantly British Pakistani men were legalised and actively covered up to prevent disorder. The rule of law was abandoned to sustain the myth that diversity is our strength, destroying the lives of thousands of vulnerable white working class girls in the process. This appalling affair is the final nail in the coffin for Liberals who still cling to the argument that Britain is an integration success story. The scandal started with the onset of mass migration, importing hundreds of thousands of people from alien cultures who possess medieval attitudes towards women brought us here. And after 30 years of this disastrous experiment, we now have entrenched sectarian voting blocs that make it electoral suicide for some MPs to confront this. This scandal shows why we must end it. There's a couple of things that I've missed out. It's not the full thing, but
I mean, what immediately jumps out at me there is, once again, what we said before about taking one element of a very broad violence against women crisis and making that the entire story, right? Jenrick, and the kind of language he uses there, I don't want to get too deep into analysing it because we don't have time, but it's very concerning when you hear politicians from the main opposition party, someone who was until very recently second in line to lead the Conservatives forward, say,
and he's still, I think it's important to point out as well that he's still a very respected figure within the Conservative Party. Come
out and say, use terminology like importing millions of aliens, the myth of diversity. This is all very concerning stuff because it lays the groundwork for conspiracy and conspiracies that, you know, we're seeing become more mainstream now about people from non-white indigenous cultures somehow coming in to destroy Britain.
Yeah.
And that's not what we do here. That's not what this country is about. And it's really concerning when thoughts like that become normalized because, you know, in the most extreme cases, as we saw over the summer, it does translate into physical violence. And also to clarify this, his name is Samuel Kasumu, a former race advisor to the Conservatives, actively condemned this and criticised this statement by Jenrick because it was so extreme. And this actually brings us nicely onto the final part of the podcast, which is discussing, you know, what's going on the right of British politics. And maybe we can talk a bit about this kind of growing disunity that also seems to be happening both between Farage and the far right and the Conservatives, but also within the Conservatives. Do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, you set me up quite nicely with the Samuel Kasumu point, because as you say, Samuel Kasumu criticised the Robert Jenrick point, and the next part to that story is that Badenoch actually spoke out against Kasumu, not against Jenrick. And I think what we're seeing in the Conservative Party and Reform UK is just a complete, like almost like a race to be as deferential to Musk as possible, to show that you support Musk as much as you can. Even Farage.
Do you think that's the case even for the Conservatives?
Yeah. I think any other Conservative Party, if Jenrick had made statements like that, I think you'd have seen them, slap on the wrist or ministerial posts taken off them, or even deselection. I think the fact that we've seen...
I could have seen that under Sunak. I think Sunak would have cracked down on that quite hard.
And just to be clear, he'd interviewed me. He was quite close with Musk.
Yeah.
My point is that I think had this issue not been championed by Musk, I think Conservatives wouldn't be talking about it in the way that they are, in the same way that Reform are. And just to be clear as well, tonight, on the day of so we're recording this on Wednesday, the Conservatives are going to try and amend the Children's Wellbeing Bill to force a statutory national inquiry into the grooming scandal. Right. Now, if they implement that, if they put that in the bill, Labour's going to vote against. They're going to have to vote against the bill completely. So the fact that they're acting in Parliament, basically doing what Elon Musk is saying, which is launch national inquiry. And as you say, we've already explained in this podcast that an inquiry has already happened. Certain people are saying that would slow down the implementation of the 2022 inquiry. The fact that Jess Phillips has said that it would be better to be chaired on a local level. There's different reasons to not have the national inquiry. So for them to basically do that, the only reason they're doing that, I think, is Musk. Is that Musk has been very vocal about this on Twitter. I think the Conservatives are trying to show that they're close with Musk, maybe to try and win his favour, maybe for financial reasons. I don't know entirely, but they're trying to be deferential to Musk in the same way that I think Reform UK are. And even after Musk suggested that Farage wasn't right to lead Reform, Farage is still trying to figure out ways to sort of mend that relationship. For some reason, the right are so we're importing issues from America into UK politics, and I think Musk is really the chief proponent behind that. I think there is a real race to try and be Musk's favourite, I suppose. And I think there's different reasons for that, but I don't know what the main one is.
Do you think the US election and the fact that Trump is mere weeks away from becoming US president for the next 4 years, do you think maybe there's some thought that if we moderate our position to become closer to that of America, then that will set us in good stead for contesting the next general election in the UK in 5 years' time? I think that's entirely
plausible. I think the financial thing with the reports that Musk wanted to give Reform UK 100 million, and the fact that that's now sort of in flux, maybe the Conservatives are seeing that as, well, if he's not giving it to them, maybe there's an argument he could give some to us, or even if they just don't, if we can persuade him not to give that money to Reform, we'll then do better at fighting off Reform at the next election. Maybe that's how they're looking at this. Maybe they are just admirers of Musk. Maybe they are there has been a move of the Conservative Party to the right, and they're more now aligned potentially with Musk and certain figures on the right of US politics. I think there's probably quite a lot of different things that come together here. But either way, I think you can quite clearly see both Reform and the Conservatives sort of being quite deferential to Musk. I truly do think that is the case.
And a final thought, maybe to close off this episode. We've had how long have we had? Two months of Badenoch's leadership of the Tories, or not even? Less than that.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out the exact date, but yeah, roughly.
Several weeks. So not long, but I think long enough, at least in my head, to expect some kind of clear platform or clear vision for her party going forward. Do you think we've had that? And what do you think Badenoch is trying to do to lead the right forward, or to lead the Conservatives forward?
Well, firstly, no, she hasn't sat out her stall at all. She's not done very many media interviews. I think she did one with The Spectator. I don't think she's done many others than that, and just because she used to work at The Spectator. So no, I don't think she's done that. I think potentially she's waiting to lay out her stall this year. Maybe she's sort of like figuring out where her party currently sits and what the best strategy is. I think her temptation is to pull it further right, and potentially she's weighing up whether that actually is the right decision. Potentially she's sort of figuring out exactly which policies she wants to champion. There's been some suggestions that she's deliberately holding back and that she's going to hit it properly this year. I think as well, maybe she sat thinking, I'm not in a rush. The next election isn't until 2029 probably, so there's not any rush to it's more important to get this right than to move more quickly. Now, other people would suggest that's a bad strategy. The Conservative Party are known for regicide. They're known for trying to topple their leader if they're not making progress. And especially when they've just lost an election, having been in power for ages. If you look at the early 2000s and you look how quickly they went through leaders after they lost the 1997 general election to Tony Blair, you see how quickly they moved through leaders. So I think maybe she's got this false impression that she has ages to turn the thing around, whereas in reality she doesn't. But I don't know. I think the point is, it's clear she hasn't sat out her stall yet. There are different reasons for that, and I think it's reasonable to expect that later this year she'll come out with more policy announcements, she'll come out harder against Labour, she'll try and make a more coherent sort of ideology outwardly for the Conservatives. I think that is something to expect from this year. When in the year to expect that, I don't know. And in what direction, I also don't know. If I had to guess, it would be that she's pulling it more right. But I think there is a chance that she doesn't, and she sort of tries to sort of moderate those people on the right, being like, I am one of you guys, but we need to try and win back others. I think that's less likely, but I think there's a chance. There's always a chance.
Plenty more for us to discuss in future as we start to get a clearer idea. And with that, this brings our first episode of Starmergeddon 2025 to a close. Yeah. Not a particularly satisfying one. I think we could have got a lot.
It's not a particularly upbeat one either.
No, not particularly upbeat. But I
hope in the future we talk more about her controversial comments on sandwiches.
Sandwiches, yeah. So, what's your favourite sandwich filling, Ben?
Oh wow. I don't know.
Not on the spot. Okay. Anyway, that's today's episode finished. In the meantime, if you haven't already, you should check out Too Long, our magazine. I really should have done this earlier, but it's fine. And you actually, if you're keen to discuss, how much influence Musk has, or Trump has, or Starmer, or even Badenoch, then check out our survey for the next edition of Too Long, which requires you to vote for who you think are the most influential people in the world right now. It's a very interesting list. Even if you just want to cast your eye over it, it's worth it. So do that, and we'll see you
in 2 weeks.
Hopefully in 2 weeks' time.
Yeah.
Have a good one.